one really knew what to expect when American voters sent Donald Trump to the White House. But now that he's logged more than a year in office, we can step back and assess how he and his administration are performing. Our next guest has analyzed Trump's first year. Andrew Taylor is a political science professor at North Carolina State University. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me, Mitch.
So, in a recent presentation for the John Locke Foundation, you discussed this as the disruptive presidency. What do you mean by that?
I mean disruptive in any sort of meaning of the word that you can think of. Just go through the dictionary and look at all the synonyms. And those can be taken both positively and negatively, of course. It's wild, it's unruly, it's antithetical to the status quo, it's troublesome, it's disorderly, you name it. I think we mean that when we talk about the Trump presidency being disruptive. It's very, very different from any presidency that we can think of, at least in the modern era.
A lot of people, as Donald Trump went into office, were pretty scared about what we could expect. After we've seen him in action for a year, are there still reasons to be fearful of the Trump administration, or do we see a little bit more of a pattern that's become predictable?
Well, unpredictability has become what's been predictable, of course. I think where perhaps the more genuine concerns of people are, regardless of where they sit on the political spectrum, aren't necessarily to do with substantive policy matters. I mean, obviously there has been a tremendous amount of change with regards to policy. On the domestic side, we see a lot of deregulation. We've had the big tax cut. On the foreign policy side, we have changes in immigration and trade policy. We have a different sort of approach to national security. It's not that so much, I think, that people who have genuine concerns are worried about. It's more in the sort of style or the administrative management approach of Trump. And there's a sort of basic concern, which isn't really an alarmist concern, and that is that there's sort of instability in the administration. We're not quite sure about its direction. And then there's perhaps a more sort of, that might be genuinely alarmist approach, which is to worry a little bit about what the effects are in dealing with other countries, particularly possible enemies, and particularly when we're talking about matters like nuclear arms and national security. So in tweeting impulsively and goading Kim Jong-un in North Korea, is that a good strategy? Is that that's, I think, some in places where people may have genuinely deep concerns about what's going on.
Some commentators have contrasted between Donald Trump, the persona, the larger-than-life person, and what he's been up to, and his administration, which they see as more or less kind of in line with what a Republican presidential administration would look like, whoever's the Republican president. Do you see that contrast, or has the Trump persona found its way into the administration as well?
Well, I don't know whether the administration is as conventional. A conventional Republican administration, as perhaps the premise of the question would lead us to believe. It's a pretty eclectic bunch of people. They are Republicans for the most part, but they've been sort of drawn together as almost like the bar at Star Wars. You know, there's this, to a certain extent, some administrations are, but they're not the obvious candidates that you would have if we had another Bush presidency. Or we had a Dole presidency, or we had a McCain presidency. They would be reaching from the established benches in the Republican ranks, particularly on the foreign policy side, where Trump has really, because he doesn't know a lot of people in politics, and the Republican foreign policy establishment doesn't really want much to do with him, where he's had to reach into the military to use a lot of generals rather than civilian appointments. So I don't think it's a particularly natural Republican administration. But having said that, I think there are a lot of steady hands there who realize that they're only there because it's Trump, not because it's a Republican president, but who have these sort of calming, stabilizing effects on the president and his immediate staff around him in the White House. So I think I'll take issue with the premise of the question in two ways there, but the cumulative effect is that there are some stabilizing people there.
We are chatting with Andrew Taylor, who is a professor of political science at North Carolina State University. A number of the people who were among that really hardline base of support for Donald Trump really wanted him to go to Washington, D.C. and kick things around, knock out the status quo. Do you think those folks are happy about the way things are going, or would they look at Donald Trump and say, "You're not doing enough to drain the swamp," using his terms?
Well, and that's where the sort of positive side of disruption, right? And I think there's a part of all of us that would like to see some kind of change, right? And thought that, hey, Trump is an agent of change, and therefore maybe this will work out. Disruption to a certain extent is good. They might not ever be able to be pleased. There may be unrealistic expectations, and to a certain extent Trump has fed those, and maybe it's his own fault that draining the swamp, changing the establishment, bringing it to its knees is just not plausible. And that the most effective kind of change in our system of separated powers and checks and balances and federalism, the most effectual change is actually that can be gradual and sustained rather than that is quick. And so maybe he's not going to please them, but maybe he is if we look back on 4 and plausibly 8 years of a Trump presidency from the position of the future. We'll look back and say, you know what, there was sort of good change there. And he did sort of drain the swamp, but it was a very slow draining rather than a rapid one. Those people might actually be surprised looking back from the future and by the nature of the change.
We're speaking now a little bit more than a year into the presidency. What are you going to be watching for very closely in year number 2?
Well, stylistically, we'll see whether, this kind of frenetic, crazy year that we've had, that Trump sort of chills a little bit, uses the Twitter account a little less frequently, makes decisions that are more conventional, perhaps creates some stability in the staff, and that's been turning over tremendously. With regards to policies, he's got the new budget out. There's an infrastructure proposal. This is the big item he's focusing on now. Where does that go? Will some of the fruits of some of the other things that have been going on in the administration in the past year, for example, the renegotiation of NAFTA, and other issues having to do with foreign policy, relationships with countries like China, his approach to the Iran nuclear deal, are we gonna see some changes in that in the next year? So I'll be looking at that with regards to substantive policy, and then whether we'll have greater stability and more normalcy when it comes to Trump's style of governance.